Live 2, please. And I will start our introduction. My name's Ginger Thompson, and I'm a director of Track 2 and overseeing the programs. I'm here today with Dulcie and Michael Murphy. For those of you who don't know, they founded Track 2 in 2004 after more than 20 years working together through Esalen Institute on their Russian American project. Which brought practices from Esalen's history of exploration into the human potential to international diplomacy, Track 2, or what's known as citizen diplomacy. For more than 45 years, they've continuously pursued a dream of a peaceful world by building a large network of individuals who are engaged with one another across borders and who share the belief that we can and must get along. Today, as part of our webinar series on Future Russia, Future US, we're happy to introduce Stanislav Kucher and Ekaterina Schulmann for a discussion on autocracy versus democracy. How have we moved to a more autocratic world, and what can be done to improve democracy's standing in this world order? Stas is known for his outspoken criticism of the Kremlin, his incisive interviews, and his long-form political analysis, making his very active YouTube channel a significant platform for discussion of various global political developments. We have linked to that chat YouTube channel in the chat. And Ekaterina, who is currently living in Berlin, is a well-known speaker on political science and economics. Stas is and
You muted yourself, Virginia.
JJ, you made it.
Sorry about that.
You're
Don't
back.
know how that happened. Anyway, Ekaterina is a professor of political science in Germany now. And she left Russia when her views on the war made staying there impossible. And she'll fill you in on more of that in the conversation. And her YouTube channel currently has more than 1 million subscribers, and it is also linked in our chat. After the discussion that Stas and Ekaterina will have, we're going to open the call for questions. We ask you to post your questions in the chat. Carol Miskell, who is our colleague at Track 2, and I will be watching that chat. And we'll ask the questions to the speakers on your behalf. Thank you all for coming and for your participation, and particular thanks to Stas and Ekaterina for joining this series with us. We're thrilled to have you, and without further ado, Stas.
Thank you, Ginger. So, well, yeah, as you said, I'm a former Russian journalist. I can call myself still a Russian journalist because I have this YouTube channel, and obviously I address the Russian audience. I worked inside the Russian media and political system, sometimes observing it, sometimes confronting it, and eventually leaving it behind. But tonight I'm not the main expert in this room. Our main expert, as you pointed out, is Ekaterina Schulmann, one of the most respected political scientists and scholars of authoritarian regimes in the Russian-speaking world. And not only in the Russian-speaking world, I'd say. Unlike me, she approaches all those issues not only as a journalist or a commentator, but as an academic who studies institutions, political behavior, and the mechanisms of power professionally and systematically. So after a few introductory thoughts from me, I'll be happy to hand the floor over to her. When we first formulated the theme of today's discussion, authoritarianism and democracy, the mood surrounding this topic was very, very different from what it is today. There was a growing sense in many countries that liberal democracies were losing confidence in themselves, that democracies had become too slow, too divided, too procedural to compete with systems built around centralized power, nationalism, discipline, and strong leadership. By the way, every time I use this word combination, strong leadership, I now picture Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio, and other people surrounding Donald Trump. Around the
And
world.
I bet you internally pronounce it in caps lock.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Around the world, people began openly asking questions that would have sounded almost taboo 20 years ago. Maybe democracy is inefficient. Maybe societies actually want a strong hand. Maybe freedom creates weakness, while authoritarianism creates order. Maybe the future belongs not to liberal institutions, but to disciplined states capable of imposing unity. And this anxiety was not limited to Russia or China. We saw the rise of right-wing populism and authoritarian temptation across Europe. We saw growing admiration for what was called illiberal democracy. We saw fears about democratic erosion in the United States itself. Many observers started speaking about a kind of new right-wing international, not necessarily a formal alliance, but a global psychological trend, skepticism toward liberalism, impatience, and pluralism, distrust of institutions, attraction to national identity, hierarchy, tradition, borders, and charismatic power. And for a while, it really seemed as if history might be moving in that direction. Russia projected strength, Putin projected inevitability, Orban presented himself as the architect of a successful alternative model for Europe. Even democratic societies increasingly looked exhausted, polarized, and uncertain. But what I love about history is that history has this habit of humiliating deterministic theories. Because since we announced today's topic, reality has already complicated the narrative. Orban suffered a serious political defeat. Putin's image of absolute control has begun to crack, not only internationally, but what is one hell of a lot more important, domestically in Russia itself. The myth of the perfectly functioning authoritarian vertical suddenly looks much less convincing than it did even a few months ago. And this is very, very important. So I'd really love us today, and especially Ekaterina, to concentrate not only on the idea of authoritarian regimes versus democracies, but also on how authoritarian regimes prove ineffective, using the example of today's Russia, because authoritarian systems often appear strongest right before their weaknesses become visible. So with this, I'm happy to give the floor to Ekaterina Schulmann.
Many thanks, Stas. Thank you for this introduction. Very glad to see all of you. And you'll have the advantage of hearing two different brands of Russian accent today, because we are both, as you might have noticed, Russians, and we both made a mistake of studying an authoritarian system or commenting on it while simultaneously inhabiting one. So don't repeat. Learn from our mistakes and then don't repeat them. I was introduced as a political scientist, which is very true. I'm a teacher at the Berlin Freie Universität right now. And I'm also an expert at the Russia-Eurasia Carnegie Center in Berlin, which is more or less what was Moscow Carnegie Center in pre-war era. So, like any political scientist, I do have my theories and assumptions about authoritarianism and democracy and the evolution thereof. But what I would like to start with is to note that the very sequence that Stas has presented perhaps demonstrates the perils of theorizing on a daily basis. So, a couple of weeks or 3 weeks ago, the constellation of news seems to point one way. And a few weeks later, elections there, a couple of articles here change our view. And now history seems to be marching in exactly the opposite direction. So our minds, a human mind, likes harmony. So whenever we have a chaotic system of dots, we try to connect these dots in such a way as to form a coherent picture, a butterfly or an elephant or a dragon, because we're afraid of chaos and we are drawn to explanations, systems, and even apocalyptic explanations are better than admitting the chaos and unpredictability of all matters human. So, despite all this, I do have my own all-covering explanation, my theory of everything, and I will share it with you. Well, I'll try to make it as concise as possible so that we'll have time for our discussion with Stas, but also we'll have enough time for questions from the audience, which is always my favorite part on any public event or seminar or public lecture. Well, autocracies do project an image of unity and power, and they invest an enormous amount of resources into producing and keeping that image. Democracies, on the other hand, are messy. There has never been a functional democracy that did not look like it is about to collapse according to the opinions of its own members. Because democracy presupposes public discussions and political competitions. And this, of course, creates the appearance of infighting, chaos, and it also produces a wealth of apocalyptic predictions. While in an autocracy, not only you are prevented from bringing the bad news to the boss, you are also prevented from airing the bad news and your own dark presentments in public. So we have the optimistic, the weirdly optimistic mood, which is so typical of any autocracy under the sun. So yes, I would agree with Stas. Never do they project this image of indomitable strength and durability more efficiently than in the days preceding their collapse. Authoritarian collapse is a thing to witness. I rather suspect we're going to see an example or two in the nearish future. And it's always so unexpected, so sudden. There is a popular book on late Soviet history written by two Russian authors, and it's aptly entitled, "It Was Forever Until It Was Over." So this is a very, very typical impression produced by autocracies. On the other hand, I can tell you that some of my colleagues, political scientists and political theorists, think that autocracy is actually the natural political state, in a sense that Thomas Hobbes spoke about the natural state of man. You will remember this grim formula, right? The natural state of man was solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. That's how he understood naturalness. In our time, natural is associated with all sorts of positive things. But nature is not necessarily benign, nor is political nature and political naturalness benign in any sense of the word. So the supposition goes, if society doesn't make an effort, and democracy requires constant effort. Democracy is high maintenance, not in the sense that it's expensive. It is not. It's not a political system for the rich nations only. We have numerous examples of relatively poor countries democratizing. But it's high maintenance in a sense that it needs civic participation. It needs regular multi-level elections. It needs constant discussions to be maintained. So if this effort is not taken, then what is produced naturally, what almost builds itself out of thin air, is an autocracy. Authoritarian political order is primitive. In this primitiveness, in this simplicity, there is an appeal. It's easy to construct, and it's relatively easy to keep. especially if you are what we call in our field a resource-based autocracy. And many of them are resource-based. I wouldn't say that I buy the idea of an oil curse. There's nothing about oil fumes that kills democracy and produces authoritarian leanings. But if you do possess natural resources, which you can dig out of the ground and sell to somebody, and with the money produced, maintain your power, it makes your authoritarian business easier, certainly. It's harder to be an autocrat if you are more dependent on individual human labor, on, to put it in even simpler economic terms, on taxes from the people, rather than on oil and gas or copper and gold or fur and wood revenues. This is why, for example, such a distinguished autocrat as the president of Turkey can do so many things, like imprison his political opponents or introduce a large-scale repressive campaign, but he cannot rig elections to an extent that is permissible in many post-Soviet countries. Because, okay, there may be many reasons for this, but one of the main reasons is that Turkey is not a resource-based autocracy. So, among all the autocracies, which I have just labeled primitive, they would not subscribe to this diagnosis. They like to think of themselves as unique while they are so similar to one another. And they like to think of themselves as highly complicated while they are really very primitive. But among all these types of autocracies, the most primitive one is a personalist autocracy. The one where power is concentrated in the hands of a leader and his closest surrounding. Why is it the most primitive? Because there are other autocracy varieties. They come in various shapes and forms, although not too many. We have the party autocracy, where there's one party that holds power, never loses elections, educates its own elites. Party autocracies are durable, exactly for the reason just mentioned, because they educate their own elites and they can survive personalities. A party is an institution. An institution is something that survives generations. We have military autocracies, juntas, where power is held by the military. They are less durable, they last less time, but they have something paradoxically of a good reputation among political scientists. Why? Because statistically, they are the most likely among the autocracies to hand power to an elected government. Why is this? Military autocracies usually happen, well, they often happen as a result of a long and finally ineffective personalized rule. So they come as saviors of a nation against an aging and failing leader. So sometimes, not always, but often, especially if it's, as I said, a relatively poor country which is dependent on international recognition and international help, and you know that you can't have international help unless you have an elected government, they last statistically from 5 to 7 years average, and then they hold elections. As I said, this is not always the case. For example, Myanmar is an example of a military autocracy which has seized power, doesn't seem to go anywhere. But in Latin America and in Africa, in countries where the army is often the most educated part of society, these coups have even got the name for themselves. It's called a good coup or a coup for democracy, which is something of a dangerous doctrine. But indeed, if you have the so-called long reign, the long rule of a leader that wouldn't go away, then almost the only power that can unsettle him is the army. So, in all fairness, I needed to mention this alternative as well. Also, there's the type called traditional autocracies or monarchies, but I wouldn't agree. If you have a well-known and publicly known succession mechanism, if you're a traditional monarchy, then it doesn't make you authoritarian. Some of the freest and most liberal nations of the world are monarchies. The monarchy serves a symbolic role, and you have a functional parliamentary democracy beneath that. At the same time, you have Middle East monarchies, which are more absolutist. However, we have those three main types: the party autocracy, the military autocracy, and the personalist autocracy. And the theory goes that it's the dream of every autocracy to personalize. At the same time, there's a curse in the very degree of personalization. It makes the system simpler. It makes it less dependent on procedures, regulations, constraints, checks and balances, and institutions. Autocracies hate to be constrained. That's why, for example, modern types of autocracies avoid having an ideology. Because an ideology, a full-scale ideology, a real one, with a sacred text, with a picture of the future, with a system of explanations for the history of mankind, is a prop, but it is also a constraint. And they want freedom of hands first and foremost. However, where's the curse? It's here. If you avoid having institutions, or if you subvert and hollow out existing institutions so that they wouldn't hamper your authoritarian thing, your enjoyment of your unlimited power, you concentrate all your power in your one golden ring, or in your one persona and his half a dozen friends. It's usually he. So when these people start to disappear for natural or supernatural reasons, there go all your agreements, all your понятия, as the Russian term has it, understandings, because you have them rather than laws. You have personal relations rather than rules. You have privileges, now not the rule of law. You have exceptions. And when, again, for inevitable reasons of generational change, there's a, generational change, you have to reinvent the system all over again. And more often than not, you have a failed state situation. Well, the term is not supposed to be polite enough these days, so we now call it fragile state, which projects an image of something precious and flower-like. And there's nothing flower-like about a failing statehood. So you either have a failed state situation, downright chaos, elite infighting, or if you are lucky enough, as the Soviet system was lucky after the death of Stalin, it managed to reinvent itself, to save itself, but also to reinvent itself on more humane rails as compared to the Stalinist time. So,
Katya, excuse my interrupting you here.
Absolutely.
But
it's
I think
absolutely
this is
necessary.
Yeah, I think this is a great moment to ask you the question that, for example, I get asked a lot by my followers on YouTube, especially those from not from Russia, from outside of Russia. They keep asking, how different is Putin's Russia from the Soviet Union of, say, the Brezhnev era? Is it stronger or is it weaker? Because on the one hand, it's a personalized regime. So it's supposed to be weaker. On the other hand, it's not based on communist ideology, and there is no scarcity of goods. There is no what we used to call deficit, right? In Putin's Russia, it's more like a state capitalist country. So it should be, from that perspective, should be stronger. So is it weaker or is it stronger? What's your opinion?
I'll give you the usual expert answer, yes and no. So the comparison is a very apt one because it shows many things, both in similarities and differences. And in our trade, in social sciences, differences are rather more important than similarities, more often than not. So the current regime is less institutionalized, therefore less stable. It's ironic that stability is such a sacred term with the current Russian propaganda, while, of course, everyone, especially now, everyone in the system must feel the trembling ground of instability. Actually, not because of some black swan that has flown suddenly into the window, but because of the internal skeleton of the system, which is based on, again, on persons, on people, and people die, while institutions remain. At the same time, in comparison with the Soviet system, this one has more adaptability. It has the advantage of a partially market economy. And I can't say partially competitive public sphere because it is not. But still, until very recently, it had a rather crowded, if not varied, public scene, and something of a public discussion, something of the variety in this publicity. So it could offer both the bread and the circuses in the ancient and time-honored formula of how to rule the populace. In Brezhnev's Soviet Union, there was still something of a collective governance as centered in the Politburo. When the archives were opened for a short time, we were able, for example, to read the protocols of the discussions in the Politburo of the future invasion into Afghanistan. And this showed both the weaknesses and the advantages of this collective governance system. On the one hand, no one supported Brezhnev that much in his idea of invading Afghanistan in order to support a pro-Soviet government there. Especially the Minister of Defense was against this plan. The army are always the last one to want to fight. That's a universal rule. Civilians can be eager militarists, but the military almost never. So they all objected, or at least no one was enthusiastic in support of this idea. But in the end, not one of them voted against it. So they voiced their objections, which we might assume maybe tempered some, maybe smoothed some angles of the scenario, the plan that Brezhnev had in mind. Perhaps hearing his comrades being so unenthusiastic about this plan maybe made him scale it down a point or two. But as to having an actual objection, as in voting against it when it came to voting, they were not up to it.
But didn't something very similar happen when Putin invaded Ukraine 4.5 years ago? Because they did have this Security Council meeting, and later we found out that quite a few members were against the invasion, but no one dared to stand up and speak openly against it.
Yes, the famous Grand Guignol histrionic event of February 21st, 2022. Those who have watched this show will never forget it. It's one of the most cringe-worthy things you will ever witness. Well, but then again, American politics these days produce some very noteworthy cringe of their own. So, yes, it shows both the similarities and the differences. First, it was public, because the president wanted the mafia-style amerta from everyone. He wanted everyone to swear allegiance. Having it streamed, of course, gave them no option. At the same time, there was, well, at the same time, yes, there was no discussion. They were asked their opinion, but there was no dialogue. They needed to come forward and proclaim their loyalty to the president, no matter what. I will remind you that the question under discussion was not invasion of Ukraine. It was recognizing the sovereignty of the so-called People's Republic, the future imaginary subjects of the Russian Federation, Russia's imaginary friends.
Yeah, which in fact did equal the invasion.
Yes, and it was not declared, but it was evidently understood by everyone in the room, except maybe the person who was most positive in his support of the whole thing, Viktor Zolotov, head of Rosgvardia of the National Guard. He was the bravest of them all because he didn't seem to have a clue of what was going on. All the other people were less than enthusiastic. Dmitry Kozak, the future dissident, actually said we should not be doing this. Patrushev, the then Secretary of the Security Council, the hawk of hawks, said we should give old man Biden another chance. The president specifically asked him, do you think we should talk again to the Americans? Will that make sense? And he said, yes, I think we should try. Patrushev has the virtue of being actually a coward, like so many KGB men. This is a good point to know. Sergei Narishkin, the head of the intelligence service, was so distracted with evidently understanding what's in there for Russia that he could not even articulate whatever. It made him look ridiculous at the moment, but post factum, his distraction seems rather human and estimable, I would say. The general prosecutor was cut off from the stream, so we don't know what he said. If the idea was to gain anonymous, full-throated support, that kind of thing failed. But coming back to my point of collective governance and Soviet parallels, there was no discussion. And the publicity prevented the possibility of any sensible discussion.
So as to what's going on now and the things that have changed since then, back then, again, there was no unity around the decision whether to invade Ukraine or not, but there was definitely there was no resistance whatsoever. So what about now? Is the Russian elite just as united around Putin as it was 4.5 years ago, or has something changed? The reason I ask is because in the past few months, we have witnessed a number of formerly pro-Putin politicians and political activists all of a sudden publicly make anti-Putin statements, publicly addressing Putin, saying, we're not really happy. People are not happy. The businesses are not happy. We are somewhere we made the wrong turn. So right now we're witnessing the weakening of Putin's positions in the elite. Yes or no? So the question is pretty short. How long will the regime last, in your opinion, now?
Well, another typical expert answer, we don't know for sure. I should say, in common decency, there has been no high-profile elite defection and no public opposition voiced by high-profile figures. What we do have is a slurry of anonymous declarations, articles in The Economist with no signature under the text or above the text, and rather, non-governmental actors, yes, public figures, but not directly connected to the state, voicing their unhappiness more or less articulately. By far the most articulate of this is a person who was not, before this, a well-known public figure, but he was a minor paid actor in the service of the presidential administration. I will not bother you with his name and surname. So we definitely need to understand that we have, and yes, I do, as a Russia watcher, I do have my impressions, perceptions, feelings, a sense of something. A change in the air, to quote my Carnegie colleague, Alexander Baunov. A bubbling something, to quote myself from a few interviews ago. But we cannot put our finger on anything very concrete. What I'm watching, and again, my species of Russia watching is watching of Russian bureaucracy. I've been a bureaucrat myself for a number of happy years, and I'm studying the apparatus. So my idea of regime fragility is not public dissent per se, but administrative dysfunction. The situation where an order is given and not followed, or it is followed and the results that ensue are not the ones that have been planned originally. To a certain extent, on a certain scale, this is what happens to any political system. Some things will go amiss. Some plans will not materialize. Some orders will not be implemented. That's normal. Again, you can easily count examples from your own experience, even on the level of a corporation or a minor business. Any sort of organization will have these cases. But according to Hegel, there's a transition from quantity to quality. Sometimes this happens a bit too often, and it becomes a norm rather than the exception. Again, we're dealing with historical parallels a little bit too much, perhaps, but to illustrate what I mean, I need to quote a historical example again. The post-Soviet, the late Soviet period. People in authority say things. They proclaim something. Now we have the new plan. Now we have the new era. Now we have this grand project. No one objects. Everyone nods. Everyone is in agreement. But then nothing happens. The system is unable to process decisions and make them into actions. And this happens time and again on various levels. In an autocracy, what is dangerous for those in power is not having a reputation for cruelty or for being above the law. This is almost expected of them by the citizens and victims of an autocracy. But being perceived as weak, this is deadly. Out of touch with reality they may be, but if they are strong enough or perceived to be strong enough to impose their own version of reality on all others, then their orders, no matter how absurd, will be followed. The example, Mao Zedong and his many ideas, like having every family working metal on their own backyard, or killing all the sparrows, or whatever. The consequences may be deadly to millions, but this is not a sign of weakness. The opposite example is the anti-alcohol campaign of Gorbachev in late Soviet Union. It was rationally based. The Soviet population was drinking itself to death really quickly. It was preventing the industries from operating because everyone was drunk. But it both irritated the people by trying to extract something from life which was perceived as an inherent part of daily life. And it failed. It created discomfort, trouble, extra worries, extra criminality, and costs for the people. But of course, it did not systemically and persistently lower the levels of alcohol consumptions. This went down since the middle 2000s for entirely different reasons. For reasons of increasing national welfare, higher incomes, gentrification of the cities, more entertainment, etc. So these are the two examples of administrative functionality despite the craziness of the order and administrative dysfunction. In today's Russia, we are not yet in this late Soviet stage, but I think we're heading there quite quickly. The fight against internet is something like the fight against alcohol, and the idea of introducing something of a dry law in late Soviet Union. It's both irritating, it's highly disturbing to people's daily existence, and it is perceived as unachievable. It cannot succeed. It is seen as something that cannot succeed. And this is a dangerous combination, to be seen as both malicious and impotent. That's
This is a
a bad combination.
Well, this is a great parallel you just gave, Ekaterina, comparing prohibition to ban on the internet and on social networks in
Well,
today's
is not
Russia.
social media the new alcohol of our era?
Absolutely. Well, a new drug, definitely. But let me share some news before I ask you one more question. The news is the Kremlin has already begun preparing a narrative of victory, quotes or no quotes, as you wish, for Russians in case the war in Ukraine ends without significant results in the near future. So, Russia's presidential office, and this I know for a fact from my sources in Moscow, has started working on how to present a possible end to the war in Ukraine as a victory to the Russian public. Um, and the effort involves a set of propaganda talking points designed to justify the signing of a peace agreement despite massive losses and the lack of meaningful achievements on the battlefield after 4.5 years of fighting. Officials working under Sergei Kiriyenko, who is the first deputy chief of staff of the presidential administration, were shown, and this happened a month and a half ago, they were shown a presentation emphasizing that one must know when to stop. That's the slogan. One must know when to stop. And according to the report, the presentation warned that continuing the so-called special military operation would require full-scale mobilization and a complete transition of the economy into a wartime footing. This in turn could lead to resource depletion, higher taxes, business contraction, additional drone attacks, and worsening demographic crisis. So this is what Kiriyenko and his team are doing. They are preparing, again, Russians for, I suppose, end to the war. And you know that there is the so-called, there are two major groups in the Russian elites. One is called Siloviki, FSB, the army, the prosecutor's office, the police, the National Guard, headed by Zolotov, whom you recall today. And the other group, they are, let's call them civilians or liberals in the system, whatever you call them, those who are against Siloviki. So, two questions instead of one. First, what's your take if or when Putin bites the dust? Who takes over? The Siloviki or the other group? And well, yeah, let it be the only question.
Yeah, that's an easy one. Uh, so it will not require
Yes and
much time
no,
in
right?
answering yes and no, and we don't know for sure. I've read the paper you are alluding to, this leaked presentation. I loved it. It's so charmingly pathetic in its attempts to explain the unexplainable and to pass off as victory what the authors of the presentation fully understand can hardly be seen as a victory by anyone. But yeah, so we must remember that it's an anonymous leak, and if I read correctly certain details in the text, it's not a very recent one. It seems to have been written before the beginning of the next Iran war. At least that was my impression, because they cite the 12 days
Wait a
war
sec.
of 2000.
The source I was referring to
Yes.
said the meeting took place this February. So
February.
before the start of the full-scale war in Iran,
Yeah.
but after the first Iran riots in early January.
Because they cite the previous 12 days war as a good example of how short and sweet wars should be, evidently not being aware at the moment how long will this next installment drag on. However, presidential administration must be prepared for all eventualities. So I'm sure they have plans and scenarios for every development under the sun. But this one is a pleasure to read. Yes. So I do think, unlike many of my colleagues who suppose that the regime has so invested itself in the war that it needs to continue with the war or fall, I don't subscribe to this opinion. I see no obstacles to stopping the war at any moment. We know from all the sociological data available that Russian society will be absolutely enthusiastic for any cessation of hostilities, and it will hardly require any explanation unless the actual Crimea is handed back to Ukrainians. All the other terms of this armistice or peace agreement will not be questioned for some time. Please be prepared for a period of national euphoria and possible renewed love for the national leader, because the Russians so much want this horror to stop that they will not look, as the expression is, a gift horse in the teeth. They will embrace the horse rather than examine it very minutely. Questions will come because the consequences of the war will be felt. The consequences of the crazy policies that led to the war and that were continued during these 4+ years will have their effect. But for a time, there will be euphoria. If they are very wise, well, if they were very wise, they would have jumped at the terms proposed by the new American administration when it was new in the beginning of the last year. It's still a marvel to me. How could such a chance be missed? It was the best for the Kremlin that they could ever hope. But I do think that we have the newest remake of the fairy tale about the golden fish. You know the fairy tale about the golden fish? It's in Grimm Brothers, but Russians know it from Pushkin's poem. It's about a golden fish that grants you wishes, and about an old woman who first wanted something very modest, some basic things for her household, and then a new house, and then to become a noblewoman, and then to become a queen. And in Brothers Grimm version, she then wanted to become a Pope of Rome. In Russian version, she wanted to become the queen of the seas. And then the golden fish grows tired of her and brings her back to her old hovel. So this seems to me to be the sad but entertaining story of Russian attempts to play at geopolitics. However, stopping the war as
Back about Putin and what happens again if he's brought down somehow, if he dies, who takes over?
It depends, in my opinion, it depends very much on the timing. The longer he stays, the higher the possibility of chaos. I'm glad I'm able to say something simple, because this is what we know from regime statistics and political history. This is what we teach our students. Long reigns, and in chaos, the longer they last, the higher the possibility. If he has the wisdom, and the Russian people have the good fortune to lose him in the course of the next, tomorrow would be great. The day after tomorrow would be tolerable. A year, 3 years. The system has great power of inertia. It's a big body. It's not too big to fail. Nothing is too big to fail, including civilizations. But it has certain resources still. So it can waddle on for 3 to 5 years. If the event happens in the interim, then we can have hopes for peaceful transition, the prime minister taking over, elections in 90 days. During these 90 days, the elites agree on their candidate. Some people fall out of windows in the process. We will survive that. We will grieve over them, but we will survive that. And then we have a chance for very gradual but democratization, because this new leader will not for a long time be as strong as his predecessor, and the power groups will have to somehow coordinate with each other to bargain, to fight, and in the process of bargaining and infighting, they will seek support of societal groups, and this will make politics more open. This is the very primitively expressed scheme of from top to bottom democratization. it has been known to happen to many nations. But last point, if it's 5 years plus, then we'll have depleted resources, brutalized society, interest groups that all have their own armies. They have them now. They are all armed. So it's like the Politburo, but with guns and drones. Then yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to bring us to a close so we have some time for some of the questions, because there's some interesting questions that will want some extensive responses. And Michael, I know you've had questions in previous chats. Please jump in, so you don't have to use the chat yourself, and ask a question. If you have one now, great. And if not, we'll bring in some of the other questions.
Do that.
Okay, should I go ahead with the other questions, Bill? No, here's Michael.
But thank you.
No, he doesn't.
Okay. I will start. So, Haim Beliak asks, what is the threat from a defense force that purges its leadership on a regular basis, combined with a reliance on hired swords? Or is the wealth distribution broad enough in the elite circles to keep people in place?
No, the wealth distribution is not broad enough for this. Russia is one of the most unequal countries in the world. Our Gini index is a shame. And recently, the Rosstat has stopped publishing our Gini index data so as not to scare the world with it, not to awe the world with the amount of equality that the Russians are enjoying. So the wealth is highly concentrated, which makes the whole system brittle. It used to have more staying power because of the trickle-down effect, which is a thing, the diffusion of wealth during the economic growth years. But economic growth years are long over. Now we are, again, I'm not an economist, so you need to invite a real economist and ask them, but I know we're in a bad place, economically speaking. So threat from the defense forces. The threat would rather be from the security forces, which is not one and the same thing. In Russia, as in Soviet Union, security services are political actors, but the army and the navy are not. It deserves a separate lecture to explain how this happened. It did not just happen, it was the result of intentional policy pursued by Stalin and his successors. And you will see that it is still pursued by the current Russian leadership, who are deeply distrustful of the army. In a post-Soviet history, only one minister of defense was a military person.
Yeah.
Both under Yeltsin and Putin and Medvedev and Putin again. All the rest were civilians and outsiders. So, in other historical examples where the elites are able to take over from the security forces, to defeat the security forces, this has been done by an unlikely alliance of civic bureaucracy and the army. Remember post-Stalin times. Who overthrew Beria? Lavrentiy Beria, the almighty head of the Ministry of State Security, who managed to amass even more power in the very few months between Stalin's death and his own. He was arrested by Marshal Zhukov, by the Minister of Defense, the Marshal of Victory, in alliance with Malenkov and the party leadership. The same, more or less the same thing happened in Romania. Who killed Ceausescu and his wife? The army. Because they were afraid of the almighty Securitat, the security service. In a post-Maoist China, the Band of Four were also a combination of a widow of Mao, head of the ideological apparatus, and head of security service. And they were overthrown, hence the name Band of Four. Had they stayed in power, they would have been called something else, something more complimentary, by the army and the party officialdom. So this is what happens from time to time when there's this long reign a leader who becomes more and more dependent on the political police and security, which is exactly the situation we see in today's Russia. I do not prophesy any such alliance. I'm just citing examples. If you are a nomenclatura, if you are a civic bureaucracy, a power apparatus, and you are opposed by a security service that can imprison, rob, and kill anyone, how can you defend yourself? Throw paper at them. You need another force that is also armed. The only other force is the army. Or you may try to, well, sometimes there are splits within the Siloviki community. In case of Russia, there's the FSB, and there's the FSO, the Federal Protective Service, and there's Rosgvardia, the National Guard. But I can hardly imagine them fighting each other. They are a community. They are a solidified repressive apparatus. So if the bureaucracy and the former oligarchy, the ones who are being robbed right now, want an exit strategy, they will need to unite themselves with somebody who can shoot.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to go on to another couple of questions. I'm holding the one about the US-Russia comparison for the last question. So very quickly, is there a unified theory or something close to it of opposition parties in authoritarian or democratically troubled states? What makes them effective or ineffective? And this is coming from David Judson.
If we have an evolved authoritarian political regime, then the existence of opposition is impossible, because the idea of an opposition is a party that could have been in power or has been in power and lost elections and hopes to come back again. The invention of the opposition is the nucleus of the genius of a democratic system, because it makes it possible to step down from power, not into your grave or into your prison cell, but into a parliamentary seat, and have rational expectations of winning another election round. For example, we have mentioned Hungary. Orban, the would-be autocrat, and he was very much an autocrat wannabe, and he spent 16 years constructing an authoritarian system, but he failed to subjugate an electoral machine. But the oppositional party won a constitutional majority, which from a political science point of view is not a very good thing. A simple majority would have been enough. A constitutional majority is too much of a temptation. And now the main guardian of Hungarian democracy is Viktor Orban himself and his party, because they have an interest in there being next elections, and these elections being meaningful, so they can get some of their own back, because now they are the opposition. The very idea of an authoritarian government excludes opposition. But if you ask about a democratically troubled state, then what makes oppositional parties valuable is exactly their role as obstacles to an authoritarian consolidation. Actually, some words have good reputation and sound well publicly, but actually mean very dangerous thing. National unity is a bad thing. Strong power is a dangerous thing. Yeah. Sovereignty, the way it's understood by the autocrats of today, is very bad for their people and for their neighbors, while international constraints are actually good for both these parties. So, opposition serves as an obstacle to uniting the whole nation under the genius leadership of the next autocrat. So they need to rely on people's support. The mistake made by many former oppositional parties of the countries that are now autocracies was relying on agreements with this or that administration, playing the preordained game, thinking they will gain more by playing by the rules rather than addressing the electorate. Once they are cut out from public support, they are throttled.
Yeah.
All these agreements disappear into thin air. Why keep the deal with somebody who is powerless? And their power was only their connection to the people. This is what killed, well, almost killed the Russian Communist Party, not the Soviet Communist Party, but the new Russian Communist Party. They decided to play by the rules.
So this, I think, is a great transition to what will be our final question, I believe, is sometimes from Anissa Mehdi, and there are a few people who echoed her question. Sometimes I think you are talking about the USA and not Russia. Can you distinguish detail the distinctions between what's happening in the States and what's happening in Russia?
Distinctions are numerous, too numerous to be mentioned, but the main one is, in your case, parties and incumbents can lose elections. Using authoritarian rhetoric doesn't make you an autocrat. Waging a war doesn't make you an autocrat. Staying in power indefinitely, this is what makes an autocrat. If you can't do that, you don't belong to the club. And thanks God, you don't belong to the club. If you have your term limits taken down, if you have elections canceled, then you have taken one huge step towards an authoritarian abyss. If this is not the thing, all the rest, I can't say it doesn't matter, it does matter. Within democracies, there are distinctions as well. But I study the autocracies and I know what they look like. You are not there. I hope you are not even heading there. I hope your great nation is just having another of these experiments, which you do from time to time. You need to somehow reinvent yourself regularly by having those heated national debates with some shooting involved, because that's your cultural tradition, or at least that's what it looks like from the outside. But again, democracies look messy. And their death is predicted every working day and on some weekends as well. But so long as you have the power change mechanism, you may count yourself more or less safe. But so as not to sound too optimistic, there's another thing. And I'm bound to mention it. Except autocracies and democracies, there's another political model, the totalitarian state. The totalitarian state is ideologically based, and it is also, like democracy, based on societal involvement. Autocracies are based on civic passivity, on atomization and depolitization of the people. Power is concentrated, resources are concentrated in the hands of the few, and people are not involved. But there's a dark secret known to political science. Totalitarianism and democracy have this thing in common. They need societal energy. They need people to get involved. Of course, democratic involvement is voluntary and diverse. You have various parties, you have public platforms, you have media, discussions, etc., podcasts, and YouTube channels. Totalitarian involvement is monopolized and obligatory. And there's violence involved, of course. But it is actually not so easy for an autocracy to turn totalitarian, which is a question we get all the time. Is it already fascism? No, it is not. However, weak democracies, if for whatever reason they enter the state of decline, can turn totalitarian. A weak Weimar Republic turned totalitarian.
Yeah.
A democratizing Russia with its budding democratic institutions of the beginning of the 20th century turned totalitarian. Because these very mechanisms that make society active, involved, and connected can become transmitters of totalitarian poison. It's like a blood circulation system in a body. It makes you alive. It brings oxygen to all the numerous organs of your body. But if you inject poison in a certain point, the whole body is transformed into a monster. Authoritarian societies are more like shellfish. They don't have the circulation system. They're difficult to unite, whether for good or for bad. So, Germany, for example, already had this very alive and complicated system of public organizations, unions, clubs, groups, political parties. If you monopolize that system, it becomes your tool in turning your society into a totalitarian hell. So, you have two parties that are deeply embedded in the fabric of society. If we imagine an effort to take out one of them and leave the other, we have a very good skeleton for a totalitarian something.
Yeah, it's frightening.
Isn't it brilliant?
That's just political theory. No offense to anyone.
Yeah, there's another comment from Anisa Mehdi. To your earlier point, Ali Larijani, an Iranian leader who was assassinated in April, told me in a 1999 interview that Iran had indeed become a democracy because people now would go into the office alive and leave the office. Oh, go into office alive and leave office alive.
Yeah, Adam Przeworski, the political scientist, famously formulated that democracy is a model where parties lose elections.
Yeah, very interesting.
I wish I could copy all the questions so that I can read them at my leisure during long spring evenings. So if the administrators could copy them and send them to me,
we will
I'd
share
be grateful.
them. Yeah, we will definitely share these questions. I want to thank you both. Stas, Ekaterina, would you like to make any closing comments now?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about one's pet subject. I wish we had more time. Thank you specifically for the questions because feedback is important. Autocracies don't have functioning feedback channels, so don't be like autocracies. Value and foster feedback channels and all points of contact with reality. So thank you very much for this chance of a conversation with an educated and interested audience. It's a privilege, and I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so
I would also
much.
like to thank Stanislav for his contributions.
Well, I can only say I'm happy that you guys have the chance to witness Ekaterina's brilliance. And she's a great lecturer. She actually can lecture for hours and answer numerous questions. So I do hope we have a chance to talk more, to listen more to her analysis in the future. And as for me, I'm always ready to comment on whatever issues connected with the Russian propaganda or how journalism evolves or degrades into propaganda, an example of Russia, because this is something that's currently happening in this country too.
Yes, it is. No. Thank you. Well, thank you both. And thanks everybody for participating. Thank you for all the great questions. And we will distribute a recording later, well, next week. And we appreciate you're all taking the time to join us today. I thought this was hugely insightful. So much appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
That was very good.
It was a very interesting,
Very.
wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're so grateful to you. There was just
Good.
I hope it was not too much of a monologue.
No.
I do tend to enter the lecturing mode, and I need some prodding from the outside to stop me.
No. It was great. And I think
It's great.
Stas came in at the right moments, and it
Yes,
was really
Yeah, he's a
fantastic.
very good interviewer. He interviewed me several times in Russian for his YouTube channel, and I'm being interviewed